My name's Tim Coats. I'm Professor of Emergency Medicine in Leicester, so I spend half my time working in the emergency department, the other half of my time working in the university. I've got a particular interest in data and the way that we use data in the health service to try and improve patient care. And I've got 15 minutes to tell you all about how data works within the health service, so it won't be any sort of problem to go through that. We can talk later on. There's lots of different complications, lots of different avenues that we can go down. However, there's a bit of history here. You probably remember a number of years ago, the government put a huge amount of money into doing a comprehensive national data system for the whole of the country. Was it 1 point something billion was put into that, and it failed. So what's happened now is a very much more regional sort of development. Most of that money, the systems that failed, were focused on the hospital side. So primary care and the GPs have developed their data systems in advance of where the hospitals were. So data within the health service, a lot of it's really started in terms of national data collection around in the Thatcher government era, with the split between purchasing and providers, when the hospitals were paid based on the activity that they undertook. So there was a lot of focus on collection of data around how many and what the hospitals were doing. So this became national returns, became hospital episode statistics, as hospitals were paid for each episode that the patient had in hospital. I guess the reason I'm emphasising that is that NHS data collection was really coming from a sort of administration and management point of view, rather than collecting electronically a lot of clinical data. However, electronic data collection did come into the clinical activity, particularly around radiology and around digital radiology, and then ways of sharing data for if you've had an X-ray in one hospital, having another hospital able to see that. And then evolution of what I call function-specific EPRs. So these were electronic records of particular facets of clinical activity. For example, the biochemistry department would have an electronic system for collecting all the biochemistry data. Different departments would have their own system for collecting different sets of data, usually bespoke systems coming from industry. At UHL at the moment, I think there are something like 340 different data systems in operation within the clinical within the clinical space. What has then happened over the last 3 to 5 years is evolution of what I'm calling the generalized EPRs. This is one electronic patient record that consolidates all of that electronic information in one place, and that clinicians can interact with that single electronic patient record. So these hospital EPRs have sort of two functions. One is they collect their own data. So when I'm working in the emergency department, I'm sticking stuff into our electronic patient record that stays in the database of our electronic patient record. But the electronic patient record also shows me all of the different electronic data that's available on the patient. So if I want to know the patient's blood test results, I click on investigations, and within the electronic patient record, I see those results of those investigations. However, although to me it looks as if that data is within the electronic patient record, it isn't. The electronic patient record is just being the front end for another system and is pulling that data through to display to me. So that when people say the data from your electronic patient record, that can mean the data that's just within the electronic patient record database, or it could mean all of the data that is displayed through the electronic patient record. So because there are these 300 and something different systems, some of that data, each of which is usually designed by a specific company, and the hospital can't necessarily look into that proprietary software to see the data. That data is then taken into a data warehouse within the hospital. The health service just has too much data to warehouse everything. If you think of the data streams that are being generated, some of our continuous patient monitors, they are day and night, this continuous stream of data. We'd have to have humongous data storage if we were going to capture everything that the health service collects about patients. So we can't warehouse everything, so things are selected to be warehoused. Now, in my clinical activity with the patients, I don't need anything from the data warehouse. What I need is the electronic patient record. So all of the clinical staff within the department are that real-time electronic patient record. None of that comes from the data warehouse. It comes from the EPR software pulling in from all these different... So the data that goes into the warehouse is the data that there is a demand within the health service for having that sort of aggregated, and a lot of that is around activity. So activity data is well warehoused. The clinical data, if I want to get, for example, sequential blood pressure readings on all of my patients to use to develop an algorithm that predicts cardiac arrest in hospital, I can't get that sort of information is not in the data warehouse. So there's very little clinical impetus or clinical need to warehouse a lot of data, which means that particularly the clinical data, there's not a lot of resources put into curation, there's not a lot of resources putting into the developing metadata and that sort of thing so that you know what's in the data warehouse. I've put an example there just of, if I get a new blood analyzer that has a different normal range. So troponin is one of the things we measure in blood to see whether someone's had a heart attack. Different analyzers have different normal range. In the hospital, we changed through the whole hospital the type of analyzer used. The normal range changed, but within that troponin data field in the data warehouse, unless you know that on that particular date that the analyzer changed, you would actually be wrong in any predictions that you'd make from that chunk of data. So current status, GP systems, each G practice, they have a whole practice system. It is a pretty integrated data, and there are often regional efforts on integrating that data together. So in Leicestershire we have LHIS, which is the Leicestershire Health Informatics Service, which is an NHS owned company that has all of the GP data from the whole of Leicestershire integrated in one place for both health service management and also as a vehicle for research and development. There are only 4 main providers of GP systems, so there's not that much flexibility for different practices to change the data that they're collecting. So that means the GPs complain about that because it's not a flexible system, but what it does mean is actually the data is in a pretty organised fashion because the same fields are available everywhere. Within hospitals, we talked about multiple commercial systems within one hospital, but there are multiple providers of EPRs, probably 6, 7, 8, something like that. Again, so there's less integration and less standardization within some of the hospital data collection systems, and the EPR focus on data retrieval and display because that's what we need for managing patients. Putting good data out the back for research and innovation is not really a priority for the EPRs. So what are the implications of this stuff when you're trying to interact with health data? I think the first is, perhaps this is a bee in my bonnet, but missingness is a real problem. So if you just take a chunk of NHS data, you'd probably, and just put it as a big table, it would probably be something like 97, 98% missing data. And that's impossible to work with. How do you work with something with, how come there's so much missing data? Well, the data's not there because, for example, I'm not a diabetic, so in my NHS record, all of the data fields that relate to management of diabetes are going to be blank. That's missing data in my record. And if you take every patient, most patients only have, multimorbidity, but they have 1, 2, 3, they have a limited number of conditions, so most of the data fields are not relevant for that patient and are therefore blank. So if you just take a big data, most of it's going to be missing. A lot of our data isn't missing at random, so it's biased missingness. And the bias is often around things like ethnicity, social class, and particular health conditions. We know that people that fall into different groups have different patterns of missingness. We also have the NHS data opt-out. So about 7% of people in the UK, somewhere between 5 and 7, have said that they don't want their data to be used for health service improvement or research. So 7% of the data you won't be able to get even when you get a data extract. And again, that's probably not a random 7% of the population. There's probably something different about that 7% compared with the rest. So missing data, one of the implications, I think, of the way we arrange data within the health service is that if you're going to use that data, you've got to have a real focus on missingness and how missingness might bias anything that you're doing. I think it means the other implication of what I've been saying about the structure of data is that there's a lot of effort needs to be put in data understanding, and I think this is a neglected phase in looking at health data, really understanding what does this data mean, how is it collected, things like, when did the analyzers change in this particular hospital, so that I understand what this data really is. So data understanding needs clinicians and NHS IT people involved in how this data came from the patient to you looking at a data set for whatever your application is. It also means there's a lot of effort needed on data engineering. If you're working with health data, you've got to do a lot of sorting out of the data before you can use it to be the basis of any application. Did a recent project looking at prediction of patient discharge, quite a hot topic at the moment. 9 months of the project was spent data engineering and about 6 weeks on doing the analytics and doing the analysis. And I think that ratio is probably about the right one to plan into any project. And that's after doing the governance stuff. So that's another. I think the last implication is because everything's being brought into the EPR, and the EPR is the way that clinicians interact with the with electronic systems, is that if you're going to do anything that's going to influence the way the clinicians work, it really needs to be integrated with the EPR. So right from the beginning of a project, thinking about how this will be integrated into normal clinical workflows is really important, and that probably means working with the EPR providers or understanding what access the EPR providers give to allow integration into the tool that clinicians are using to interact with the patient. Doing a standalone app, I think I've got, is it 40 or 50 clinical apps on the phone that I use at work? Another app isn't really going to be the way that clinicians are going to use to interact with data. I've got 1 minute to talk about secure data environments, SDEs. This is just coming across the horizon. The government is putting a lot of money into health data, secure data environments. There are going to be regional R&I secure data environments for the NHS, which were, if you want to interact with an NHS data set in future, it will be put, rather than someone giving you an anonymized data set, it will be for you to work on under a contract and data sharing agreement. The data will be put into one of these SDEs, and then you will be able to come into the SDE in a very controlled way and interact with that data. You won't be able to take any of the data out of the SDE, but you will be able to take your algorithm, your product, your sort of tables or whatever out. So it will be a way that, if it is set up right, and that process is what's just starting at the moment, will make it much easier for industry to interact with health data. If it's not set up right, it will be just another barrier that you'll have to get across. So I think watch this space for NHS R&I SDE secure data environment. This is multi-million pound government investment going, 154 million or something going into this over the next 5 years or so. On my last slide, this is a meeting we had on health data science last year in the university. There's a lot of interest in data science within universities. There's a lot of people that you can interact with if you want to link through the groups that have been talking today with university activity. I think I'll stop there, and I think chance for questions will be in a panel discussion just a little bit later on. Thank you.